It was raining that afternoon, the kind of rain Oxford knows by heart. Not the theatrical kind that batters windows, but the quiet, continuous drizzle that seems to soak into the city's bones. I remember thinking that the stones themselves must have grown tired of it after all these centuries, the same grey weight falling on the same narrow lanes. I was standing beneath the Radcliffe camera, collar turned up, pretending to admire the symmetry of the building, when, in truth, I was waiting for courage to arrive. There was a service that morning. Not a funeral, precisely, though it felt like one. A dedication, the programme had called it, in honour of Professor Llewellyn, whose contributions to moral philosophy remain undimmed. Undimmed. I had stared at that word far longer than necessary. A polite fiction. We dim, all of us, slowly, elegantly if we're fortunate. The chapel had smelled of damp hymnals and old regret. The choir boys from Magdalen, I think, had sung with that clear, detached beauty that makes you ache more than comfort. And somewhere between the psalm and the reading, I found myself wondering why I had come at all. I had met Llewellyn twice in my life. Once during a lecture about the ethics of concealment, and again years later when he'd written to me about a former pupil who had gone missing. He'd called it a matter of moral interest. I had found the girl. He had sent a note of thanks, that was all. Yet here I was, attending his memorial as though summoned. When the service ended, I walked out into the drizzle and lit a cigarette, an old habit revived for old reasons. A young woman had stood near the gate, holding a damp folder to her chest. She had the kind of expression I've learned to notice, not grief exactly, but the absence of anything that could pass for composure. Her gloves were too thin for the cold. She kept pressing her lips together, as though rehearsing silence. She spoke first. She said she'd known him, Professor Llewellyn, and that she'd written something for the dedication, but hadn't had the courage to read it aloud. Her voice carried a faint Welsh cadence. She asked if I had been one of his pupils. I told her no, though perhaps I should have been. She smiled at that. Then, almost absently, she opened the folder and handed me a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was angular, deliberate, the ink smudged in places by the rain. At the top, in small, neat letters, was written, "For the one who believed knowing the truth was never the same as telling it." A dedication within a dedication. I asked if she had written those words. She said she had not noticed that they were his, found among his papers after his death. She had wanted them read aloud, but the college had refused, calling them unsuitable. I asked what they thought it meant. She said quietly, they thought it meant guilt. There was something in the way she said the word, not accusation, but recognition. I asked if Llewellyn had been ill. She shook her head. Then, after a pause, said he had died unexpectedly. An academic euphemism, I thought. There are few things less unexpected in Oxford than an elderly man dying in his sleep. But she went on, lowering her voice as though the drizzle might be listening. He had left his study in perfect order, she said, books aligned, pens capped, the day's newspaper folded precisely. Only one thing was missing, a small leather notebook he always kept locked in a drawer. The lock had been forced. The notebook is gone. I remember looking past her at the chapel doors where the last of the mourners were dispersing. I said something about coincidence, a word that has lost all innocence for me. She looked up sharply then, as if I'd struck a match in her darkness. "You don't believe that, do you?" she said. I told her belief was a luxury I'd misplaced long ago. She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you could help me find it." The rain was heavier by then, turning the cobblestones slick and reflective. She wrote her address on the back of the program and said she would be there until evening. Her name, when she gave it, was Clara Morgan, a name that seemed too fragile for what she carried in her eyes. I walked back through Radcliffe Square, the air thick with the scent of wet stone and resignation. Beneath the arches, the bells began to toll the hour, slowly, deliberate, and oddly consoling. Somewhere between the second and third chime, I understood what had unsettled me about the inscription she'd shown me. It wasn't the phrasing, nor even the implication of guilt. It was tense, for the one who believed past, perfect, final. By the time I reached my car, I had already decided to visit her. Not because of curiosity, though, that played its part, but because I've learned that some dedications are written for those still alive to understand them, and I have never been good at ignoring invitations written in the language of regret. The porter at All Souls had remembered her, Clara Morgan. He said she came often in the last term before Professor Llewellyn's death, though never during daylight, always after hall, when the cloisters were empty and the stones gave back her footsteps. There was something deferential in his voice when he spoke of her, as though she'd brought with her not scandal, but sorrow, the kind that leaves no mark except a quiet vacancy. I sat for a while in the senior common room, nursing a reluctant cup of coffee and watching the rain gather against the tall windows. The place smelled of oiled wood and old decisions. A small group of dons sat in one corner, arguing in low, ceremonious tones about the reform of the syllabus, each phrase weighted like an epitaph. One of them looked across at me briefly, his eyes full of that dry curiosity Oxford keeps for intruders who wear the wrong expression. I've worn it most of my life. Llewellyn's portrait hung near the fireplace, a modest likeness, though the painter had captured the particular arch of irony in his mouth. The dedication below was precisely Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy, 1957-1986. That last date still seemed too recent. I found myself studying the background of the painting and the indistinct shelves behind him. Something about their order troubled me. All the spines were painted blank, unlabeled, as though the painter had known that in the end Llewellyn's greatest devotion was not to what was written, but to what was withheld. The bursar joined me. A thin man, brittle in voice and manner. He remembered Llewellyn with a kind of cautious reverence, as one might remember a particularly demanding deity. When I mentioned Clara Morgan, he frowned, saying she had been his research assistant for a brief period, though her appointment had never been made formal. Unofficial, he called it a word Oxford reserves for the unacknowledged truths everyone knows, but no one prints. She had, he added, left rather suddenly shortly before the professor's death. He spoke of her with the patience of a man untangling delicate wire. Intelligent, he said, too intelligent perhaps. She had proposed a new interpretation of Llewellyn's work, something about the ethics of confession. The old man had been unsettled. There had been a paper, possibly even a letter, but neither had surfaced after his passing. The bursar glanced at me as though I might be the reason. Such things occasionally do. When he left, I wandered through the corridor toward the old library. The air grew colder, the walls narrower. I have always liked that corridor because it carries its centuries well. At the far end stood a locked display case containing several of Llewellyn's annotated manuscripts. Each page bore his precise, slanted handwriting, black ink, unhurried, immaculate. But one note caught my eye, a marginal scribble beside a passage on moral autonomy. It read, "Responsibility is not confession, it is memory that cannot be altered." The phrasing struck me as both defensive and personal, a man trying to convince himself of something he no longer fully believed. The librarian appeared then as a woman of indeterminate age, brisk in gesture, soft in gaze. She told me Llewellyn had often stayed late in the library after closing hours. I asked whether anyone had accompanied him. She hesitated. "Sometimes," she said, a young woman, quiet, polite, always carrying a small leather notebook. She had assumed it was for dictation. I told her it had gone missing. She nodded, unsurprised, as though theft were just another form of scholarship. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began their steady descent into the evening. I paused beneath the archway, feeling the drizzle return like a memory of the previous day. I thought of Llewellyn, alone in his study, aligning pens, folding newspapers, arranging the last small evidence of order before surrendering to whatever chaos lay beyond. And I thought of Clara Morgan, standing in that same rain, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she handed me his final words. There is something particular about scholars, I have learned. They treat truth as though it were a fragile artifact to be handled with gloves and returned to its case when company arrives. Yet somewhere among the dust and silence, a single sentence had been left uncovered, one that refused to fade into footnotes. I stood there, listening to the rain. A phrase from one of Llewellyn's lectures drifted back to me, his voice precise, amused. "A man's virtue lies not in what he confesses, but in what he endures in silence." It sounded noble then. Now it sounded like a warning. There are few things more revealing than a letter that never found its way to the post. It speaks not of what someone wished to say, but of what they couldn't bear to. The following afternoon, I sat in Llewellyn's study at the college, or rather, in the small annex that had once served as his retreat. The bursar had granted me an hour before the room was sealed for archival purposes, a phrase that always sounds like exorcism in academic circles. The study felt preserved rather than abandoned. Books lay open in careful disarray, the curtains half drawn, as if the last light of his final evening had been measured deliberately. On the desk, a glass of water, untouched, a pen resting against a blotter like an unfinished thought, and beside it a small pile of correspondence bound with twine. Most were routine invitations to conferences, courteous refusals, the usual dance of vanity and duty. But near the bottom was a single envelope addressed only with a first name, Clara. The handwriting was his, unmistakably elegant, slanted, impatient with perfection. The envelope was unsealed, inside a single page. I hesitated before reading it. There are boundaries even for the curious, but curiosity is rarely polite. The letter began simply, "My dear Clara," then nothing but a paragraph crossed through with deliberate ink strokes. Beneath, in smaller, steadier writing, "Truth is not what we owe the living, but what we owe the dead." I remember staring at that line for a long time. It wasn't philosophy. It was a confession disguised as a reflection of a man attempting to reason with his conscience. The absence of a date, the unposted state, the careful obliteration of the first paragraph, each gesture spoke more loudly than any signature. Llewellyn had written something he could not send and then tried, with professorial precision, to erase it, but not destroy it, never destroy. He had kept it, knowing someone would find it, perhaps hoping someone would understand. The air in the room was thick with the faint sweetness of old tobacco. I could almost see him here, sleeves rolled, spectacles off, writing under the modest halo of a desk lamp. A man revising not a paper, but a conscience. I traced a finger over the indentation where his pen had pressed hardest. There was another sheet beneath the blank, but faintly impressed with the ghost of the words above. The missing paragraph lived in reverse relief, half visible in the right light. I tilted it toward the window until the lines began to appear, fractured but legible. A few words error, she knew, no choice left. It was then I noticed something oddly domestic, a second glass faintly ringed on the polished wood. The bursar had said nothing of visitors. The porter, too, had mentioned no one after the evening bells. But there was a subtle trace of company. Not wine, water. 2 glasses, side by side. I felt an old unease stir the intimacy of an ordinary object left too carefully behind. Outside, a small drizzle began again, whispering against the panes. I sat back, listening to it. In Oxford, rain is never simply weather, it's punctuation. Each drop underlines something you meant to forget. A small deduction, half-born, began to take shape. The missing notebook, the letter, the careful staging of order in the room. All of it suggested orchestration rather than accident. If Llewellyn had died peacefully, as they claimed, he had done so only after arranging his piece like a scholar curating his final lecture. And someone else had been there to witness it. Someone who had shared his last drink of water, perhaps his last sentence. I replaced the letter, sealed the envelope as I had found it, and returned it to the stack. There is a certain humility required when trespassing in another man's unfinished thoughts. As I stepped into the corridor, the scent of beeswax polish met me, that faint, institutional attempt to disguise age. The floorboards creaked beneath me as though reluctant to release their secrets. Outside, the quadrangle was quiet except for the cry of a rook overhead. I looked up, half expecting to see the light still burning in his window. But it was dark now, clean, proper, final, and yet I couldn't escape the feeling that somewhere between those crossed-out lines and the missing notebook lay not the end of a life, but the continuation of an argument, one that had never truly left the company of the living. The night after visiting Llewellyn's study, I found myself back in my flat with a half-finished crossword and a glass of whisky that had long since surrendered its chill. The city outside was quiet, that peculiar Oxford quiet which hums beneath the weight of thought. Somewhere a clock struck 9, though it might have been 10 times like truth, tends to lose its edges when one stares too long at what refuses to yield. I had spread the photocopies of Llewellyn's papers across my desk. They were meticulous, of course. Paragraphs that looked like sermons, margins crowded with counter-arguments, quotations, the occasional wry Latin aside. Yet one page, the third in a draft essay on moral silence, had drawn my attention earlier that day. Not the text itself, but the footnote. A small, easily overlooked annotation marked with a faint asterisk. See Private Correspondence, CM, November 1985. The initials seemed harmless. Enough. To anyone else, perhaps they would have been. But I had already seen that unsent letter addressed to Clara. The handwriting on the footnote was different, sharper, less fluent, as though written in haste. I took another sip of whisky, turned the page toward the lamplight, and saw something I hadn't before: the faint impression of a word written beneath the ink, erased but not entirely gone. I fetched a pencil, shaded the surface lightly, and the ghost of a name appeared. Not Clara's. Morgan. It was then I realized the difference. Llewellyn never called her by her surname in the other papers, not once. Always Clara, always personal, which meant this footnote might not have been written by him at all. The thought settled uneasily. Someone else had handled his drafts, someone aware of her initials, and familiar enough to risk adding a note in his absence. I found the file from the bursar's office, a list of those who'd catalogued Llewellyn's work after his death, 3 names. One stood out: Dr. Julian Crewe, his closest colleague and long-time rival in the faculty. Crewe, the kind of man who could smile while dismantling another's reputation, and call it pedagogy. I remembered him vaguely from an old departmental dinner, a booming laugh, a fondness for port, and a tendency to lean too close when quoting Aristotle. I visited him the following morning. His rooms at St. John's smelled of old cigar smoke and self-regard. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me, or as genuine as an academic can afford to be when a policeman darkens his door. We spoke of Llewellyn first, the sadness, the loss, the legacy. His tone was practiced like a man revisiting an elegy he had already delivered many times. I asked whether he had assisted in sorting the professor's manuscripts. He admitted as much, adding that it had been a privilege tinged with melancholy. He smiled when he said it. When I mentioned the footnote, the smile faltered. He said he remembered no such thing, but his fingers betrayed him tapping once, twice, against the rim of his teacup. That faint, percussive rhythm I've come to recognize as the sound of concealed memory. I let the silence lengthen, then he spoke again, softer now. She was his pupil. You know how these things go. Affection becomes dependence. Dependence becomes danger. He paused, studying me. You must understand Llewellyn wasn't a man of impulse, but he was capable of error. The word error returned to me from the ghosted letter in his desk. It lodged in my thoughts like grit beneath the skin. I asked Crewe what had become of Clara after she left the college. He shrugged a gesture rehearsed into virtue. He had heard she went north, perhaps to teach. Perhaps. The word echoed between us, too light to trust. As I rose to leave, he added something almost casually. He said he'd once seen Llewellyn tearing pages from a notebook, the same leather one that had since vanished. The act, he said, had unsettled him. It wasn't the destruction that struck me, but the deliberation. He looked away as he said it, toward a window blurred with drizzle, as though he were editing his own conscience. Back in the corridor, I paused by a notice board littered with student announcements, tutorials, half-forgotten debates. My eyes caught on a scrap of paper pinned between two event flyers, a fragment of an old seminar notice. The title read, The Ethics of Concealment, Guest Lecturer C. Morgan. The date, 1 week before Llewellyn's death. I took it down quietly. A footnote to the case, perhaps. Yet footnotes, I've learned, are rarely minor. They exist where the author hesitates, where meaning hides in smaller types. I folded the paper into my coat pocket and stepped into the rain. Oxford's spires blurred against the wet evening sky, and for a moment the whole city seemed to lean toward secrecy, as though it, too, preferred what could not be said aloud. The chapel had always unnerved me, not because of faith I had misplaced that long before, but because of the silence it demanded, the kind that presses against the skin until one feels compelled to fill it with movement, a cough, anything human. That evening, however, I entered it willingly. The porter had given me the keys reluctantly after I mentioned that I was following a matter connected to Professor Llewellyn's death. Oxford porters respect death. It gives them something to guard that can't be answered back. The air inside was thick with incense and the faint, waxy sweetness of extinguished candles. The pews glimmered with the sheen of centuries of polishing, and the great organ loomed in the shadows like a sleeping confession. I walked slowly down the nave, the sound of my steps swallowed by stone. Somewhere near the choir stalls I stopped. It was not the beauty of the place that held me. Beauty rarely does, but a small, irregular darkening on the flagstone floor. A stain, perhaps, or simply shadow. Yet I found myself crouching, tracing the outline with my fingers. Wax, melted and hardened, pooled near the corner of a wooden lectern. A candle had burned there recently outside of service hours. The verger had mentioned that the chapel was kept locked at night. I had confirmed it myself, so whoever had been here had either held a key or the kind of authority that never needs one. I looked toward the front pew, where the nameplates bore their neat engravings, fellows, emeritus professors, benefactors, and there, near the aisle, I saw one I had not noticed before Llewellyn. I sat for a while in that pew, my hands resting on the worn oak. The cushion beneath carried the faintest indentation, as though someone had sat there recently, not long enough to leave warmth, but long enough to be remembered by the fabric. I tried to imagine him here, the great moral philosopher, kneeling in the darkness, whispering into the void he had spent his life dissecting. A small noise broke the stillness, footsteps, not imagined. This time, I turned and saw Clara Morgan standing at the back of the chapel, her coat drawn tight, her face pale in the dimness. She did not look surprised to see me. She said she had come to return something her voice barely carried. From her bag, she produced a thin notebook, the leather scuffed, the clasp bent. Llewellyn's missing book. She placed it on the pew beside me, as though laying down a burden. I asked where she had found it. She said it had never been lost. He had given it to her for safekeeping, she said. A strange phrase for something so personal. She sat down then, the distance between us measured not by space, but by all that remained unsaid. She told me that Llewellyn had written in it most nights, notes for lectures, fragments of thought, private reflections he never intended to publish. But toward the end, his writing had changed. It had grown restless, uncertain, full of questions he once would have dismissed as sentiment. She paused, looking toward the altar, where the candle wax gleamed faintly in the light. He had come here the night before he died, she said, sat right there, and wrote his final entry. I opened the notebook. The handwriting was indeed his, though looser, less composed. The final page contained only one line, written twice, as though he had needed to convince himself. Silence is not innocence. The ink had bled slightly at the end, the mark of a trembling hand or failing light. I asked her why she had kept it from the college. Her eyes met mine, calm, resolute. Because they would have buried it, she said, like they buried him. She rose then, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the stained glass. Before leaving, she added quietly, that he had not died alone. The candle, she said, had burned for two. When she was gone, I remained seated for a long while, the notebook open on my lap. The words seemed to hum in the still air, not innocence, not innocence. I thought of Crewe, of his careful phrasing, his convenient grief. I thought of Llewellyn's letter, of the erased paragraph that spoke of error, and of the footnote in another's hand. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the chapel windows like a hesitant confession. I rose at last, closing the notebook. As I locked the door behind me, I noticed the faintest wisp of smoke curling upward from the lectern, a candle, extinguished moments before my arrival. I have often thought that a library, more than any church or courtroom, is where guilt most patiently resides. The shelves at All Souls bear witness to it not in words, but in the absences between them, books borrowed and never returned, volumes misplaced, misfiled, or intentionally hidden. The quiet record of concealment disguised as scholarship. That afternoon, I found myself in the upper reading room of the Fellows' Library, where the dust seemed older than the air. The librarian had granted me permission to examine Llewellyn's personal collection, recently donated to the college. It was a curious archive, heavy on classical ethics, light on theology, and oddly incomplete. A few gaps interrupted the otherwise perfect symmetry of the shelves, like missing teeth in an otherwise immaculate smile. I had asked for the catalogue of his holdings. It came in the form of a ledger, its inked columns careful, almost reverent. Each title followed by a date of acquisition and a neat notation of its final condition. Only one entry was marked otherwise. The Ethics of Confession withdrawn, 1985. The librarian had circled it faintly in pencil, as though to remind herself of an unresolved riddle. I asked if she recalled who had withdrawn it. She hesitated. The record, she said, showed only initials, CM. That's simple. That is unhelpful. And yet, the moment she said it, I felt the weight of recognition. Clara Morgan again, the same initials that haunted the footnote, the same letters written in another hand beneath Llewellyn's notes. I asked if the book had ever been returned. The librarian shook her head, though her gaze drifted toward the upper shelves, where a ladder leaned idly against the wall, as if still waiting for its last climber to descend. When she left me to my own devices, I climbed the ladder myself. The upper shelves held volumes untouched for decades, the kind that crumble if stared at too sternly. I traced my fingers along the spines, reading the titles in the dimness, a treatise on silence, the virtue of secrecy, on the confessional mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. Then, near the end of the row, I noticed a volume slightly misaligned, thinner than the others, wedged too tightly into its place. I got it free. It wasn't The Ethics of Confession, though it wore its dust, as though it had been hiding just as long. The title, in faded gold, read, Studies in Moral Contradiction. Inside, the front page bore Llewellyn's signature, his hand unmistakable. But beneath it, in smaller script, another inscription for CM, who understood before I did. The words chilled me in their humility. He had given it to her, then, or meant to. I turned the pages carefully. Near the end, a folded sheet of paper fell out. It was a library request slip, yellowed, the handwriting precise, reconfession and silence, see appendix in volume, marked red. It bore a date 14th November 1985, 2 days before Llewellyn's death. I searched the shelves again, looking for any volume bound in red. There was only one small devotional text lodged improbably among the moral treatises, Meditations on Sin and Salvation. It seemed out of place, like a prayer book misfiled in a philosopher's library. Inside its back cover, a page had been hollowed out by a crude, deliberate cut. The cavity was empty now, but the shape of a small rectangle was unmistakable. The size of a notebook. Llewellyn's notebook. I stood there for a long moment, holding the mutilated book, feeling the echo of its absence. I remember the sound of rain beginning again, against the tall windows, faint but insistent. It drew my thoughts back to Clara Morgan, the way she had placed that notebook on the pew, as though it were a relic she had never truly owned. Had she removed it from here once to protect him, or returned it later after it no longer mattered? The evidence refused to choose its allegiance. When I descended the ladder, the librarian had returned. I asked whether Llewellyn had ever used the library after hours. She said yes, occasionally, but never alone. A colleague would often accompany him, she thought Dr. Crewe. Her voice softened when she added that the two men had quarrelled often, always in whispers. About what, she couldn't say. But once, she recalled, she had found a torn page on the floor near their table, a page from the Ethics of Confession. I thanked her and left. Outside, the quadrangle was deserted, the stones gleaming faintly with evening rain. The smell of damp paper still clung to my coat. Somewhere behind me, a bell began to toll, slowly, deliberately, mournful. I thought again of the hollowed book, the vanished notebook, the dedication for the one who understood before I did. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that understanding often arrives too late to be useful, like a letter misplaced in the post, finally found after its meaning has expired. It was a marginal note that betrayed him. Not a confession, not a grand revelation, but a small, untidy correction scrawled on the edge of a typescript. I found it the next morning in the archive room, where the air always feels slightly medicinal, as though it's been treated against memory. The clerk had allowed me to review Llewellyn's last submitted article, a piece meant for a journal that never published it. Moral Responsibility and the Veil of Silence, a title that sounded like philosophy, but read like a man writing against himself. The paper was dense, restrained, unyielding, but the citations were meticulous, each one checked and double-checked, all except one. Halfway down the page, a reference to an obscure German essay appeared, Verantwortung und Schweigen, J. Crew, 1984. The name made me pause. Crew had claimed never to have published on the subject, yet here was a citation, precise, consistent with Llewellyn's obsessive habit of accuracy. I turned to the bibliography, the same title, same author, same date. But when I later searched for it in the Bodleian catalogue, it did not exist. There was no such essay, no such publication, no trace of it in any journal of that year or the years surrounding it. Crew's ghost had entered Llewellyn's paper, cited, quoted, but not real. That evening I walked across to Crew's rooms again. The lights were on. Through the window I could see his silhouette, bent over his desk. He had the posture of a man performing repentance in private. He opened the door with a smile that didn't belong to the hour. I told him I had been rereading Llewellyn's last work. He nodded, his eyes cautious, then said that Llewellyn had asked him to review the draft a week before he died. He claimed he'd offered minor stylistic suggestions. It was his phrasing that betrayed him. Minor stylistic suggestions. Llewellyn, a man allergic to external editing, would have accepted none. I asked, gently, whether he remembered a citation to his own essay. His hand stilled on the back of a chair. He said perhaps there had been a mix-up, that Llewellyn had misattributed a lecture they once discussed, but the unease in his voice suggested otherwise. He offered me a drink of whiskey, predictably. As he poured, he spoke of his old colleague with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. How they had spent years debating moral frameworks, how their disagreements were merely academic. But I remembered the librarian's remark, the whispers, the torn page, the candlelight quarrels. I asked if he had ever known Clara Morgan. He looked up then, sharply, as though I'd stepped across an invisible line. Yes, he said finally. She had assisted in their joint seminar once. An intelligent young woman, too intelligent perhaps. When I left his room, the rain had turned steady again, soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed like black glass. The night was quiet, but my thoughts were not. If the citation was false, it meant Llewellyn had either invented a reference to protect someone else's words, or Crew had added it later, inserting himself into the professor's intellectual afterlife. Either explanation felt too deliberate to be accidental. Back in my flat, I unfolded the photocopy of the manuscript again. In the margin near the disputed citation, a faint pencil mark had been added, not Llewellyn's sharp script, but something more hesitant. A single word, barely legible ours. The next day I compared it to Clara's handwriting from the dedication sheet she had given me. The same looped R, the same uncertain tail on the S. It was her mark, not his. She had handled the paper, annotated it, perhaps even typed the reference. But why? And why attribute a non-existent essay to Crew? A small deduction began to surface, then fragile, half-formed, like the first note of a melody remembered in sleep. Llewellyn's article on silence, his unsent letter, the erased paragraph about error, Crew's invisible essay, Clara's hidden presence in the margins. The ethics of confession had ceased to be theory. It had become correspondence between three people, each trying in their own way to write themselves out of guilt. Later that evening, as I sat again with my crossword, a clue caught my eye. Error in source 5 letters. The answer, of course, was false, but it lingered on the page like a quiet accusation. It was nearly midnight when the telephone rang, the kind of call Oxford gives only to those who have stopped expecting kindness. The porter from All Souls spoke with an uneasy formality about a disturbance in the Fellows' building. He said Dr. Crewe had been found, unconscious in his study. Not serious, apparently, but peculiar. I remember thinking that peculiar was a word the city used when it meant uncomfortable, but not yet tragic. When I arrived, the corridors were heavy with the smell of burnt paper. A faint grey dust clung to the skirting boards, as though someone had tried to erase the past and only managed to smear it. Crewe sat upright in a chair by the window, his complexion ashen beneath the lamplight. The college physician was fussing beside him, declaring exhaustion, overwork, perhaps too much port. But the air told a different story. The hearth was cold, yet the grate was filled with half-burnt pages, fragments of typed paper, edges blackened, text still visible in places. I asked what he had been burning. He said softly, only drafts, useless things. But I had already seen the heading on one fragment, moral responsibility, and the veil of silence, Llewellyn's paper. I knelt, retrieving a corner that had escaped the flame. The text bore a marginal note in pencil, the same slanted hand that had written the word ours in the previous manuscript. Clara's. I asked if she had been here that evening. He hesitated, then admitted she had. She had come, he said, seeking to clear her name, to explain the notebook, the letter, the false citation. But her explanation, he added with a bitter smile, had not been the one he expected. I waited for him to continue, but he only stared into the grate as though what remained of their conversation was still smouldering there. When he finally spoke, it was with that tired eloquence men use when trying to sound rational in the aftermath of emotion. He said she had confessed not to murder, but to authorship. The false essay attributed to him had been hers, written in defense of Llewellyn's declining faith in his own work. She had urged him to publish it under Crewe's name, believing it would protect Llewellyn's reputation. When the professor refused, Crewe had threatened to expose the deception, to ruin them both. It sounded too clean, too polished, the kind of confession one fabricates after rehearsal. I told him that guilt, when genuine, rarely arrives with footnotes. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for a glass of whiskey and drank it as if it were medicine. I left soon after, the half-burnt pages folded into my coat. By morning, the newspapers had their version, an accident, an incident of fatigue and smoke inhalation. Crewe would recover. Clara Morgan, meanwhile, had vanished. Her rooms in Summertown stood empty, her books removed, her papers gone. A neighbour recalled a car arriving late in the night, headlights extinguished, engine idling just long enough for someone to disappear. The porter found a note pinned to her door. 3 words: he was wrong. For a few days, I allowed myself the comfort of believing the matter concluded, a professor's death, an assistant's guilt, a colleague's shame. All the tidy boxes ticked. Yet something about it refused closure. The burned manuscript, the false citation, the phrase in Llewellyn's letter, "Truth is not what we owe the living, but what we owe the dead." That evening, as I poured myself another measure of whiskey, I noticed the crossword I had abandoned days earlier. The clue I'd left unsolved read, misleading conclusion, 5 letters. The answer arrived too easily, false. I almost smiled. I looked out across the rain-streaked glass toward the dreaming spires, their outlines softened by mist. For once, I allowed myself the quiet admission that perhaps the solution I'd accepted was never the one intended. Perhaps Llewellyn's death had not been a philosophical accident at all, but a correction and editing of conscience by those too intimate with guilt to let truth survive. And so I left the crossword unfinished, the answer unwritten. Some errors, I've learned, are better left uncrossed. There are moments, usually well past midnight, when a case begins to dissolve rather than resolve. The lines blur, the edges soften, and what once seemed so certain begins to look like handwriting left too long in the rain. It was on one such night that I found myself back in Llewellyn's study, the rain whispering against the window panes like an old refrain. The college had reopened the rooms for cataloguing the archivist had given me an hour before she locked up again. The place felt smaller now. Without the aura of death or curiosity, it was just a room filled with the debris of an intelligent man's final days. Books still aligned with mechanical precision, the blotter replaced, the chair neatly centered beneath the desk. Yet there remained one thing unchanged, the faint smell of ink, that metallic sweetness that clings to every act of thought. I lit the desk lamp. Its cone of light revealed the same manuscript I had examined before, Moral Responsibility and the Veil of Silence. But this time I wasn't reading for meaning, I was reading for absence. The false citation, the marginal hours, the vanished notebook, they had all formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. What I sought now was the one thing I had missed. It came to me, as these things often do, through triviality. A small inconsistency in type. The manuscript was typed on an Olivetti, the same model Llewellyn had used for years. The letters were even, the ink consistent, except for one word. In the middle of the final paragraph, the word innocence appeared slightly darker, its edges thicker, as though retyped after correction. I looked closer. The letter N was faintly misaligned, just a fraction lower than the rest. Llewellyn's machine, I knew, had a perfect carriage. Someone else had used another typewriter to alter the line. I turned the page over. On the reverse, faint impressions revealed earlier text, the ghost of a phrase that had been replaced. I held it up to the lamplight and could just make out what had been typed there before deletion. Ignorance is not innocence. The substitution had changed the entire meaning of the argument. It was perhaps the smallest act of forgery imaginable, yet it felt enormous. Whoever had replaced that word hadn't done it for grammar. They had done it to absolve someone, to soften what Llewellyn had intended to condemn. I sat back in the chair, the lamplight trembling faintly as the wind pressed against the window. Clara's face came to mind, her stillness, her refusal to defend herself. I could see her there, one evening after his death, returning to this room, feeding a single page into his machine, striking each key carefully. Not to hide guilt, but to protect what she believed deserved gentleness. The falsified citation, the rewritten phrase, the missing notebook. They were not the footprints of deceit, but of loyalty. I poured a measure from the bottle that stood discreetly on his shelf. It tasted of time and a little of regret. Outside, the chapel bells struck 10. I remember thinking that Llewellyn himself would have admired the symmetry, his disciple rewriting his final argument, his colleague burning the evidence, his own silence preserved as though it were a form of mercy. There was, however, one last thing. On the underside of the blotter lay a single sheet of onion skin paper, the kind used for carbon copies. The typing was almost invisible until I angled it toward the light. It was the same sentence again, in Llewellyn's hand this time, ink rather than type. Ignorance is not innocence. But below it, written faintly in pencil, another hand had added, nor is love. I sat for a long while, the two sentences layered like truth and its shadow. Beneath the formality of philosophy lay something fragile, almost the record of two people trying, in their separate ways, to make peace with a man they had both loved and failed to understand. When I finally left, I took nothing with me. The archivist locked the door behind us, unaware that the room contained all the answers anyone might need. though none that could ever stand up in a report. As I stepped into the quadrangle, the rain had eased, leaving the stones slick and gleaming. The lamplight caught on their surface like ink spilled across parchment. For a moment, the reflection of the chapel window shimmered beneath my feet, words written upside down, unreadable, dissolving into darkness. And I thought not for the first time that truth in Oxford is like ink beneath the words always present, always faint, and never quite dry. It was the sound of bells that woke me. Not the clear, confident peal of midday, but the slow, uneven kind that drifts through the city before dawn, uncertainly, human. I had fallen asleep at my desk, the lamp still burning, a book of medieval sermons open before me. The margins were full of notes I hadn't written, Clara's handwriting. She'd once told me she loved the sound of bells in Oxford because they made time seem less exacting. She was wrong. Bells in Oxford don't mark time, they haunt it. I stepped out into the square just as the mist began to thin. The stones were slick with rain, the air thick with the faint smell of coal smoke. Somewhere behind the college chapel, a figure moved the verger, I thought at first, but then I saw the quickness of her pace. Clara. She didn't see me. She crossed the cloister with the quiet resolve of someone performing an errand she could no longer postpone. I followed at a distance, the echo of her footsteps mingling with mine. She slipped inside the chapel through the side door. The bells, still tolling, masked the sound of its heavy hinge. Inside, the space was dim and restless with shadows. She stood before the altar, not kneeling, not praying, simply staring up at the carved stone. In her hands, something small and black. I thought at first it was a prayer book, but when she set it down upon the pew, the light caught the edge of its cover. The notebook. I didn't speak. There are moments when intrusion feels like desecration. She turned, eventually, her face composed but colourless. She said she had come to return what never should have left, that it belonged here not to the college, nor to the living, but to silence itself. I told her that Llewellyn had not written those final words for an audience. She smiled faintly. Then he failed, she said. We all fail. It was the only time I ever heard her voice tremble. The first note of deduction arrived almost absently, like the flicker of a match. Her coat sleeve was damp, not from rain, but from ink. A dark stain near the cuff. I remembered the manuscript page, the altered word, the faint difference in the colour of the ribbon. She had typed it herself. Perhaps that very night. I asked her if she believed changing a word could absolve him. She looked past me, toward the east window, where the morning light was beginning to burn through the glass. She said softly that absolution was for those who still believed in sin. The bell stopped then, leaving a silence so complete it felt material. I heard the faintest scrape paper against wood. She had opened the notebook and slipped a single page inside before closing it again. Her hands lingered on it as though committing it to some final custody. Then she walked past me toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried. I didn't follow. After she was gone, I approached the pew. The notebook lay open to the last page. The handwriting was not Llewellyn's, though it tried to be. A careful imitation, almost tender. It read, "Silence is not innocence. It is the only truth that forgives." Outside, the bells began again, this time a brighter peal. The hour of first service. The city was waking. Students hurried through the mist. The porter yawned at his post. The newspaper boy pedalled across the square, scattering droplets in his path. I stood beneath the chapel archway, watching the spire tremble with sound. There was a beauty to it, that distance between noise and meaning. The bells spoke without knowing what they said, and perhaps that was their grace. I thought of Llewellyn, of Crewe, of Clara, each bound by their own version of truth, each unable to bear the weight of its echo. Later that day, I learned that Clara had left Oxford by the afternoon train to London. No one knew where she had gone after that. Her rooms were empty, save for a single envelope addressed to the college bursar. Inside, a cheque. The amount covered the full cost of the missing volume, The Ethics of Confession. I remember walking home through the drizzle, the bells striking again somewhere behind me. For once I didn't try to count them. There are truths that lose their shape when named, just as there are sounds that only exist in their fading. When I reached my flat, I poured a drink and turned on the wireless, though I can't remember what played. The music merged with the faint memory of those bells, and for a while I could almost believe that silence too was a form of understanding,